Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to install the Havoc Offroad 4.5-inch lift kit on this 2014 Chevy Silverado 1500. Now before you get started, you need to know that there is going to be some cutting and some minor welding on this application. So just make sure you read through the instructions and that you're comfortable with it. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, we got our truck up on the lift, our wheels and tires are off, and now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the two bolts that are holding the ABS line to the frame and to the control arm. I'm going to take those out, and I'm also going to release this clip here that's holding on the ABS line. Next thing we're going to do is take our tie rod off. And that's going to be a 21 millimeter. Before we thread that off all the way, we're going to leave a couple threads on, and we're going to strike the knuckle to release our tie rod. So then we can remove that nut the rest of the way and pull the tie rod out. All right, so our joint was spinning, so if that happens, you'll have to get a 10 millimeter to hold the bottom, and then you can loosen it up. Now we're going to use an 18 millimeter to remove the brake caliper. That's going to be a bolt here and a bolt up here. So we're just going to use a bungee, and we're going to slip it right through the brake caliper, and we'll try to find a spot on the frame to hang it up. So now we're going to use a T30 Torx to remove this bolt on the rotor, and then we can remove the rotor. So the next thing that we're going to do is remove this dust cover. So you want to go around, try to just create a little bit of separation. You can use a small chisel, a small screwdriver. So now we're going to mark the orientation of our sway bar. Since we're on the passenger side, we're going to put a PA, and that's just so when we go to reinstall it, we remember which side is which. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the sway bar from the end link, and then we're going to do that on both sides and then remove the sway bar from the vehicle. So we're going to use a 15 millimeter on the top and bottom of our sway bar end link. So once you've completed all those steps on your driver's side, now we can take off our sway bar. There's going to be two 10 millimeter bolts on your passenger side and two on your driver's side. And once you get all four bolts out, the sway bar will just fall off. Now we're going to remove our ABS line from our hub using a 5 millimeter. Once you get the bolt out, the ABS line should pull right out. And then you can just push that out of the way. Next, we're going to remove these two 15 millimeter bolts that are holding the strut to the lower control arm. Next, we're going to remove these 6 15 millimeter bolts that are holding our CV shaft on. Before we do that, we need to mark the passenger and driver side so that when we're putting it back together with our spacers, we get the correct CV on each side. Next, we're going to use a 18 millimeter to remove the upper ball joint nut. And again, same as the tie rod, I'm not going to take it all the way off because as you can see, it's caught in there. So we're going to have to strike the knuckle to get it to release. So before we strike the upper ball joint to release it, we're going to loosen the lower ball joint. And again, we're not going to completely take the nut off. We're going to leave a couple threads on there so that when we do strike the top and it breaks loose, it'll catch the knuckle on the bottom. All right, so we broke the top loose. Now we need to break the bottom. Again, I just want to strike the knuckle here. I want to make sure I don't hit anything else, the control arm or the threads. Okay, so now we're going to take our axle shaft nut off, and that's going to be a 1 7/16. Alright, so now that we have our upper ball joint broken and our CV axle shaft nut is off, we can go ahead and remove our upper ball joint nut. So now you can push the CV shaft through the hub assembly and you should be able to pull it out the back. Now we can remove our lower ball joint nut and remove the hub assembly from the vehicle. Next, we're going to remove the 3 nuts holding on the top of the strut assembly. That's going to be an 18mm. Once those bolts are out, you should be able to push your lower control arm down and remove this from the vehicle. Next, we're going to remove our 2 lower mounting locations for our lower control arm. On your head side, that's going to be an 18mm, and on your nut side, that's going to be a 24. So once you've removed your lower control arm, you're going to want to repeat those steps on your driver's side. Now that you have both sides of the vehicle tore down, we're underneath, and if you have a factory splash guard, you're going to want to remove that now. This truck doesn't have one, so we don't have to worry about that. But what we're going to do is you have 2 braces that are connected to your front and rear cross members, and we're going to remove those. It's going to be 4 bolts total, and using a 15mm. Next, we're going to remove the rear cross member from the vehicle, and that's going to be an 18mm on the head and nut. Now we're going to make an alignment mark on the drive shaft, and that's to show the relationship between the drive shaft and the input flange, so when we put it back together we can put it back in the right orientation. So now we're going to use an 11mm to remove the 4 drive shaft bolts. Okay, so we are on the driver's side and we're at the rear crossmember pocket, and we're going to have to make a cut on this pocket. So we're going to measure 3.5 inches from the end, and then we're going to draw a vertical line here, And then we're going to make the same mark on the opposite side and then connect the two with a vertical line or a horizontal line along the top. And then we're going to cut that out. Next, we're going to remove our differential actuator connection, and it's going to be kind of hard to get to, but there's a little red retaining tab on it that you're going to have to pull out, and then you should just be able to push in and it should pull out. Next thing we're going to do is remove the breather hose. So now we're going to remove the differential from the vehicle, so you're going to want to make sure it's supported with a jack. And the first bolts that we're going to take out are two on the driver's side, and that's going to be two 18mm bolts, one right here and one right here. All right, so now on your passenger side, you're going to have two 21mm nuts, one on each ear here and on the other side here. All right, when you're taking this second one out, you want to be careful that you're not having anything using an impact, that nothing is hitting these connectors here. So you might have to wiggle it or angle it back a little bit to get it past everything else and get it out. But once you get it out, you can just set it to the side. Now that we have the surface clean, we can go ahead and weld our provided plate in place, and then we're going to go ahead and wait for that to cool, and then we're going to paint all of the metal so that it does not rust. Alright, so now our welds are nice and cool, and we're going to just go ahead and spray paint it. And this is just going to keep it from rusting. So you want to make sure that you're painting all of the exposed metal. Okay guys, so the next thing that we're going to do is trim this ear off of our differential. We're going to trim the one that is right next to your differential actuator, and we're going to basically cut this whole thing off. And then we're going to go on the other side and trim just a little bit off the end. But when you're doing this, we're going to use a cutoff wheel. You want to be extremely careful. You don't want to hit your flange. You don't want to hit your actuator. So just take your time and just be extremely careful. Okay, so on the other ear, we're going to use a tape measure, and we're going to measure from the middle of the oval hole and out to the end, and at 1 inch we're going to make a mark, and then we're going to cut this side off. So get our straight edge, and we're going to go ahead and cut right along that line. The next thing that we're going to do is install our center differential bracket. To do that, we're going to have to take out 4 bolts off of the differential housing, and that's going to be this one, the one underneath, and the one on the side here. And then we will put our bracket in place and use our provided 4 bolts with washer, and make sure that you're using red Loctite on these to go through the bracket and back into the differential. So your kit's going to come with some red Loctite. Again, I'm going to say that you use this when you're putting these new bolts in. You don't want this to come apart on you. Okay, now we're going to torque these bolts to 33 foot-pounds. Okay, so next are pockets on the rear of the truck on the inside need to be trimmed to provide for some CV shaft clearance. So they stick out about a ½ inch right now. We need to grind that down so it's about 3/8 of an inch from the inside of the pocket. We need to do that on the driver and passenger side. So now once you have it trimmed up, you're going to want to paint that to make sure it doesn't rust. Now we're going to install our driver side differential drop bracket. We're going to use factory hardware for this, and it's going to thread into the 2 locations that we took the bolts out for the differential. And now you can tell that this is the driver side drop bracket because it is double gusseted, whereas the passenger side drop bracket has only got a single gusset. But we're going to go ahead and tighten this, these 2 bolts to 65 foot-pounds. Now we're going to put our passenger side differential drop bracket in place, and as you can see, it's only going to fit one way, and we're going to use our factory nuts on the ends, and we're going to tighten those down to 65 foot-pounds as well. Now we're ready to put our differential back in. We got our hydraulic jack back out, and we're just going to keep jacking it up until it starts to line up with our new brackets. Alright, so once you have the differential just about in place, we can start connecting the differential to our drop brackets. So on our passenger side, we're going to have one fat bolt and a fat washer, and that's going to go through our differential. Got that side, Anthony? And then it's going to go through the bracket, and we have another washer and a nut to go on the end. We're just going to leave that loose for right now. So now we're going to use our provided bolt washer through the differential, through the bracket, and then another washer and a nut. And we're going to do that on both driver's side locations. And again, we're just going to leave this loose for right now. Alright guys, so right now, before we tighten up our differential bolts, we're going to go ahead and plug back in anything that we unplugged. Next, we're going to reinstall our drive shaft. So we're going to pay special attention to the marks that we made earlier and make sure that those are lined up. And then we're going to use our factory hardware. We're going to tighten these bolts down to 19 foot-pounds. That's good.
Is it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Spin it. Yep. Right there. All right. So now we're going to put in our new rear cross member. We're going to use the factory lower control arm bolts, and we're going to run those from the front of the vehicle to the rear of the vehicle. Now we're going to install our front cross member. And again, we're going to use our factory lower control arm bolts, and we're going to put those in from front to rear as well. Alright, so now we're going to attach our differential center bracket to our front and rear cross member. And you're going to get a provided bolt with a washer, and then you're going to put another washer and a nut on the end of it. And you're going to do the same thing on both cross member locations. Next, we're going to torque down our center differential mounting bolts to 90 foot-pounds, and that's going to be a 7/8 on the nut and a 13/16 on the head. Alright, now we're going to tighten down our passenger side bolt. That's going to be 120 foot-pounds. And that is a 1-inch wrench on the nut and a 15/16 on the head. So now we're going to install our differential skid plate. And we're going to use a provided bolt and washer. and they're going to feed right through the threaded holes in the front and rear crossmember. Should be 2 bolts in the front and 1 in the rear crossmember. And we're going to put a little bit of Loctite on those. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten these down. Next, we're going to install our crossmember support brace. And again, we're going to use our provided hardware with a washer, and we're going to use a little bit of Loctite. And we're just going to leave that loose for right now. So now we're going to install our lower control arms, and we're going to use our provided bolt and washer, go through the control arm, and then washer and nut. And you're going to want to make sure you run these bolts from front to rear. And you also want to make sure that you're using the longer bolt in the rear crossmember. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten down our crossmember bolts to 125 foot-pounds. We're going to do that on all 4 bolts. Next, we're going to use a 3/4 inch socket to tighten down our crossmember brace to 65 foot-pounds. And then we're also going to tighten down our differential skid plate. Those 3 bolts are also going to be 65 foot-pounds torque. So now we're going to install our strut spacer onto our strut assembly. These are only going to fit one way, and they aren't side specific, so it doesn't matter which one you grab. But you're going to use your provided washer and 3 nuts per side. And then you're going to use your factory nuts when you reinstall it in the vehicle. We're going to tighten these down to 30 foot-pounds. Now we're going to reinstall our strut assembly. We're going to use our factory hardware at the top, and we're just going to leave that loose for right now. Now we're going to raise our lower control arm up, and we're going to reinstall our factory bolts through the bottom of the control arm and into our strut assembly. And we're just going to leave those loose for right now. Now we're going to tighten our upper strut hardware to 40 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to tighten our lower strut mounting hardware to 40 foot-pounds. We're going to use a 15 millimeter. Okay, so now we're going to remove our hub assembly from our knuckle, and we're going to use a 15 millimeter and remove these 3 bolts. All right, so we got our dust shield here. We're going to use a vise, but we're going to have to trim this up to make some extra room for it. So what we need to do is on the side with the cutout, we're going to measure a 1/2 inch in from the edge. We're going to make a mark, and then right where this bend is in the middle, we're going to draw a straight line from our mark to the edge. And that's going to be what we're going to cut off. All right, so now we can put our modified dust shield onto our hub assembly. Make sure that you have the opening where the ABS line is going to go. And then when you put your new knuckle on top, make sure that the hole in the dust shield lines up with where your brake caliper is going to hang. And then we are going to reuse our factory bolts, and we're going to apply some red Loctite to those bolts. We're going to tighten these bolts to 133 foot-pounds. Alright, so now that we have our knuckle assembled, we can attach that, use our factory nut at the bottom of the lower ball mount, and we can just let that hang there for right now. Alright, so now we're going to put our knuckle through our upper ball joint, and to do this you might have to have another person lift up on your knuckle while you get a pry bar and pry down on your upper ball joint. But you're just going to use your factory nut and thread that back on there. Okay, so we're going to reinstall our CV shaft now. And you're going to want to feed that through your control arm. And then you're probably going to have to bend it down a little bit to go back through the knuckle. And once those splines meet up, you can just push it through. And then you're going to reinstall your washer and nut. So now we're going to go ahead and tighten our CV shaft nut to 155 foot-pounds. Now we can tighten our upper ball joint to 37 foot-pounds. Now we're going to tighten our lower ball joint to 74 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install our CV shaft spacer. You're going to have to push in on the shaft a little bit to get it in there. It's going to be a tight fit, so just work on it. But once you get it in there, Make sure you line up all your holes. Now you're going to use your provided 6 longer bolts. They're going to be Allen head bolts along with washers. And you're going to want to make sure that everything's lining up nice and easy. And you can go ahead and twist those in by hand. And you're also going to want to use some red Loctite. Alright, so I'm going to tighten these down to 45 foot-pounds, and I'm going to tighten it down in a crisscross pattern. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is remove the tie rod, because we're actually going to trim this a little bit. To do that, I'm going to put it back in the knuckle, and that's just so it can hold it there while I break the jam nut loose. So I have a 15/16, and I'm going to use that to break that jam nut loose. And then pull this tie rod off. Alright, so we got our tie rod and we got it in a vise. We're going to have to trim about 5/8 of an inch off. So we're going to go ahead and just mark at about 5/8. And we're just going to make a straight cut all the way across. Now off the inner tie rod piece, we also need to cut off about a 1/2 inch of threads. So what we did was we screwed the nut all the way down until only about a 1/2 inch was showing, and we're actually going to leave the nut there, and we're just going to clip it off right there. And the nut is actually going to act as a guide, and then we can run that over a couple times to clean up any burrs or anything that's on the end. Alright, so now that we have that piece cut, we're going to measure the end, and we're going to screw the nut all the way back to so there's about 1/8 of an inch showing on this end, and then we're going to go ahead and screw our tie rod back on. And if we did everything properly, it should go right back on. And we're going to thread this all the way down to our jam nut. Once you get the tie rod screwed all the way back to the jam nut, we're going to just loosely install it in the knuckle, and then we're going to go ahead and tighten down our jam nut. Now we're going to reinstall our dust cap. Now we're going to attach our ABS line, and to do that we're going to feed it over the top of our knuckle, and it's going to go right through the hole in our dust shield and fit right back into the hub assembly where it came out of. And we're going to reinstall our factory bolt. So we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. Now we can also reinstall our rotor. Make sure you line up the holes where our bolt is going to go, and then you can go ahead and just tighten that down. So the next thing we need to do is remove this bracket from our brake line. Now to do that, we're going to take our retaining clip out, and we're going to slide the brake line down or up a little bit, depending on which way you want to go with it, to get it away from this hole here, and then we're going to cut a couple slits in there so that we can pull it out of the bracket and then remove the bracket completely from the truck. Now we're going to reinstall our brake caliper. Again, we're just going to use our factory bolts. We're going to tighten this down to 125 foot-pounds. Alright, so now we're going to install our new brake line bracket, and it's going to go right over your brake line like that. You want to make sure your opening is facing out because it's going to attach down in your factory location. You're going to have to re-bend some of your lines, so just be careful with that. But once you have it down, we're going to reinstall our clip. Alright, so once you have your bracket bent enough, you should be able to just put your factory bolt back in, and we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. So for this bottom ABS bracket, you can just take a pair of pliers, squeeze the bottom portion together, and the bracket should slide out. And then from there, the clip should just come undone and it can come right off. Alright guys, so if you aren't as comfortable with a cutoff wheel, you can take a pair of pliers, a couple pairs, and just bend this bracket off, but it takes a lot longer to do. So if you're comfortable with the cutoff wheel, we suggest this way to get this bracket off, but if not, just go ahead and use the pliers. So your kit's going to come with a couple clips for your ABS line. The first one is going to go through the control arm, and then we're going to use our factory bolt for that. So in the bottom hole is where we're going to put our self-tapping screw along with another retaining clip. Next we're going to reinstall our sway bar. Your kit's going to come with 2 sway bar drop brackets. They're just going to be kind of box-shaped spacers. And it's going to come with 4 new bolts that are going to be Allen heads. And we're going to reinstall those back to the factory locations. And you want to make sure that you use a little bit of Loctite when you're putting these back on. We're going to tighten these down to 45 foot-pounds. So now we're going to attach our new sway bar links. And to do that, you're going to go from the top down, and we're going to start off with your link, a metal washer, and a rubber bushing, and that's going to go through the top. And then next you're going to put another bushing, and then another metal washer, and then your metal sleeve, a metal washer, another bushing, which looks like it's going to be getting a little tight, so you might have to push up on your sway bar like that, and then another rubber bushing, and then another metal washer, and then a nut at the bottom. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and tighten those down. And we're gonna tighten it down just until the bushings start to form to the control arm and to the sway bar. So once it starts to swell a little bit, we're gonna go ahead and call that tight. So next we're gonna tighten down our tie rod to 44 foot-pounds. And then once that's tight, we can go ahead and repeat all of these steps on the opposite side. Okay, so now we're in the rear of the vehicle, and the first thing that we're gonna do is remove the brake line bracket here from the differential. We're gonna use a 10mm to do that. Next, we need to remove the ABS line from the frame rail on the top and bottom and on both sides, so that when we start to drop the differential, we don't get it caught on anything. And we also need to remove our parking brake cable bracket on our driver's side. That's going to be a 13mm. Alright, so at this point you're going to want to make sure that your differential is supported, either with a hydraulic jack in the middle or with a couple jacks on either side. And we're going to remove the shocks on our driver and passenger side. Now that we have the shocks off on the driver and passenger side, we're going to take the U-bolts off on the driver's side. When you're doing this and taking the U-bolts out and putting your spacers in, you want to do this one side at a time. It's going to be a 21mm. Now with the U-bolts out, we can actually lower the driver's side. Take out our factory spacer. And as you're lowering this down, you just want to keep an eye on all your lines. Make sure nothing's getting tight. Alright, so now we're going to take our new spacer block and lower it down. So we got enough room to put that in there. Your spacer is also going to have a slope. It's going to be tilting down in a particular direction. You want the slope to be going towards the front of the truck. So once you get it in there, we can start raising it back up. And you want to pay attention to your locating pin on your leaf spring and kind of help guide the spacer into that locating pin. So once it's in there, it should fit nice and flush, and go ahead and lift that side back up. And then we can install our new U-bolts. And at the bottom, you're going to have a washer and a nut. And then we're gonna go ahead and snug this up. We're gonna do our final tightening on the ground. Now repeat that on your passenger side. All right, so next we're going to install our shocks, but before we do that, we need to insert the bushings and the sleeves at each end. So we're going to use some heavy-duty silicone, and we're just going to spray the bushing and spray a little bit on the inside of the shock, and we're going to use a rubber mallet. And if you can get it pretty good and straight on, you can usually do this in one shot. And you can do the same thing on the other end. And then repeat that with the other shock as well. Alright, so now we're going to install our shock. We're going to use our factory hardware. And we're going to do the top first. Now to get the bottom in, you're actually going to have to push the shock up a little bit. And then at the same time, put your bolt through. And your nut at the end. And we're going to go ahead and tighten those down. So now we're going to use a 10mm inside of our bump stop. And there's actually a bolt that's through the middle. We're going to remove that, and we're going to put in our bump stop spacer. Alright, so our spacer is going to go right in our factory location, and we're going to use our provided Allen head bolt to go through the factory bump stop, through our spacer, and back through the threaded hole in the frame. We'll go ahead and tighten that down. Alright, so your kit's going to come with a brake line bracket, and we're going to install that where we took out our original factory brake line bracket. We're going to use our factory bolt to go back into the differential, and then a provided bolt, 2 washers and nut to connect the 2 brackets. Once you got that in place, you can go ahead and tighten those bolts down. Alright, so now we're going to reinstall our factory ABS clip. We're going to install the ones at the bottom of the frame, not the ones at the top. Alright, now we're going to reinstall our parking brake bracket. Okay guys, so we're underneath the truck, we got the wheels and tires on, we bounced the suspension a little bit, and now we're going to do our final tightening down of the U-bolts. We're going to tighten those to 140 foot-pounds. Okay guys, now we're at the front of the vehicle, and we're going to tighten down our lower control arm bolts to 150 foot-pounds. Alright guys, we just got the truck back from the alignment shop. Now we did have to do a little bit of trimming for our wheel and tire combo, but that completes the installation. If you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online. Thanks.